Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Pat Biltgen. I was the Astronaut Scholar from Georgia Tech in 2001. And I have the... Oh, I'm sorry. So I didn't get the memo on what is cocktail attire. I asked Mike Mullane, how should I dress, and this is what he suggested. He's a Big Bang Theory fan, and so that's kind of how that happened. So... modeling's later. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panelists, Vance Brand, Walt Cunningham, Gerry Griffin, and Fred Haise. And thank you all for joining us for this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The Apollo 7 and 8 missions were the first crewed flights of NASA's moon landing program, and that's crewed as in C-R-E-W-E-D, not C-R-U-D-E.
Some people might disagree with it.
That's on the next page of the script, Walt. So Apollo 7 had the first live TV broadcast from an American spacecraft. It successfully tested the Apollo command and service modules, including the spacecraft's primary engine. They called it the big engine, which on later flights would need to be fired to get in and out of the moon's orbit. At the unveiling of the Apollo 11 50th anniversary coin ceremony last month, Walt was present, and he said Apollo 7 may have been the most successful flight test program of a new spacecraft in the history of the country.
I did not say maybe.
That is true, he did not say maybe. Now, the success of that mission proved that NASA's hard reset after the Apollo 1 fire had reinvented and reinvigorated the US space program. Subsequently, Apollo 8, originally slated to be another test flight in the sequential program that would test the command module and the lunar module in Earth's orbit, was changed. The lunar module was behind schedule and overweight, so they made, the government allegedly received intelligence that the Soviets were closer to launching a flight around the moon than planned. And the Apollo program made the Apollo program made the boldest decision ever made in an engineering project to go around the moon on the second manned flight. And it became an unprecedented journey, both from a spiritual and technological standpoint, and 3 humans from planet Earth became the first life forms to ever fall into the gravity well of another celestial body. And this occurred 50 years ago. Now, these 2 missions made it possible to put humans on the moon, and those are the pioneers that we are celebrating here tonight. So thank you all for being here for this tremendous event. Now, it's not possible to begin the discussion on Apollo 7 without first mentioning the sacrifice of the crew members from Apollo 1 that tragically died in the fire in 1967. And so the beginning of our discussion, Walt, I'd like to ask you some questions about that. You served on the Apollo 1 backup crew. And one day prior to the pad fire, you and Wally Schirra and Don Isley were on pad 34 in the same spacecraft conducting a test of the vehicle. Can you tell us a little bit about that test, and then the immediate reaction to the fire and the contributions of how what we learned from that event changed our approach to human spaceflight?
I will try to do that, but you may have to remind me of some of the things you just said. But it was a very critical time. What people probably don't know today, unless some of the older ones, which I see around there, they know what went on. But before the Apollo 1 fire, Wally Schirra, Don Isley, and I, we were on the prime crew for what was going to be Apollo 2. And we started living practically out with North American as they were trying to construct it. It's not like today when you got the spacecraft and you just plug into it. We were busy building the spacecraft. We did not have simulators built yet, so we were anxious to have the time of being in the cockpit and getting familiar with the equipment. So we practically lived at North American Rockwell. That was Apollo 2. And for the first time, North American had to put up with astronauts coming out there and being critical of what was going on. They were a marvelous developer of new aircraft, North American was. But the pilots of those days only got involved very late, just before they, in fact, probably about the time they started flying, so they didn't have to put up with that. So that bothered North American a bit. And the schedule kept slipping because of the changes that we wanted to get done. When that happened, eventually, I think we had been on that crew for 7 or 8 months, and they canceled that mission. When they canceled that mission, because we were working with the same spacecraft as the Apollo 1 spacecraft, that was Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. They put us then in as the backup crew on Apollo 1. And we were working together with Gus, Ed, and Roger for about 3 months, and come to think of it though, so for your reality, so you know, they were scheduling a launch, I think in February, for Apollo 1, and on January 27th of, that was 1967, they had the fire. And it was the thing that we had performed the night before, but the hatch had been open, and we performed the same tests, we didn't have the same problem, and it was only about maybe a 15-minute test that we had to do. And the next day, on Friday, they were going to do with the closed hatch, and most of you probably know about the fire there, but they spent hours. The reason that happened was they spent hours inside that spacecraft, and this was operating on internal power. So they didn't have the plugs in, so therefore they closed the hatch on that. And it was a hatch that you could not open from the inside. You had to take a bunch of security stuff down in order to do it. And Wally, Don, and I, we had waited, for most of that day, because we thought we'd just prime and backup crew, we'd both fly back together, and we gave up about 4 o'clock. I remember that, and the 3 of us, Wally, Don, and I, we headed out for home. By the time when we landed at Ellington, which is right next door here, there was the vice head of of all of our flying operations, and he was there waiting to meet us as we pulled into the chocks, which was very unusual, very unique. So we knew something had gone wrong. We didn't have any idea what. So he told us about it. It was hard to believe that it happened. But that crew, they died in a fire on the pad, and I think it was about 19, 20 seconds is all it took. And we all worked, the 3 of us worked in one part or another on the follow-up and on some of the investigation of some of that particular thing. But what happened there is a couple of days, maybe it was 2 weeks, I think, or 3 weeks, we got moved up then to the prime crew. So here we are operating the same spacecraft, but all of a sudden there was a hold. So all of a sudden, for the first time ever, North American started paying some attention to what we did. We started fixing up anything that contributed to the fire from spacecraft CSM-101. And so most of those things, incidentally, were operational improvements for us. They were for the operating of the equipment for the crew. And we fixed anything that could have had a problem with the fire. Now, the fire itself was, we got there because it was a stupid treatment up until that time. We had wires inside the spacecraft that were not all behind protection. They were sitting out there. And in zero gravity, they might not have been a problem, but in 1 gravity, you can step on and do all those kind of things to it. So at that point, we were moved into that, and only 21 months later, and I say only 21 months because we've had other fatal accidents in the human space program. And as time has gone on, we've gotten slower and slower at correcting those problems. Problems that may have been tougher to fix, but I think on the shuttle, for example, I think the next accident we had where people were killed in the spacecraft, I think it was 31 months before they could go fly. The next one after that, I think, was 34 months, or something in that neighborhood. So everybody really worked on getting back from the fire on Apollo 1. 21 months later, we launched, It was a near perfect spacecraft. We were 2.5 minutes late on liftoff. I remember that irritated us because nothing else was going wrong. And Wally, he had no hesitation about speaking out about what bothered him. And I remember that we did that. On board, we had a little concern about the wind up there. When you launched in the command module at that time, I think the limit on the wind was about 18 knots, because if you had to abort early on in the launch, and that wind could, and depending on the direction, it could blow you back onto shore, and we had a spacecraft that could only land in the water. But one time it was up about 21 knots or something like that, and Wally went on record as complaining about it. But the only thing that bothered us about that launch was the 2.5 months late, 2.5 minutes late. And we launched on what to this day, still, as you mentioned there, it's the longest, the most ambitious, most successful first test flight ever. And I feel very good for having been on that mission.
Thank you, Walt. Let's get a round of applause for that. Now let's talk about a little how we got there. Vance, prior to your assignment to the Apollo 8 support crew, you were a crew member for the 2TV1 thermal vacuum tests designed to evaluate the Apollo command module. Can you tell us a little bit about the testing regime to prepare the module with all these changes and how that all integrated into the flight test plans for Mission 7 and 8?
Sure. This was a test. The purpose was to really qualify the spacecraft thermally and keep an eye on the systems, correct anything that went wrong there. So the test was to last about the same length of time that it would take to go to the moon and come back. There were 3 of us on the crew, Joe Kerwin, physician astronaut, Joe Engel, who had flown the X-15, and myself. We were in I guess you'd say, a pretty good replica of the vehicle that was to be flown to the moon. It wasn't perfect. It didn't have all the structural braces and everything that you'd have on a lunar vehicle, but it was pretty hi-fi. There were, well, it was a spacecraft that it was a command and service module sitting on a sort of a lazy Susan type device that would rotate the spacecraft, and inside a chamber that could be taken down to extreme vacuum and could simulate the heat and the cold of space. They had intense lighting to simulate the sunlight, and they had liquid nitrogen in the walls, and so they would also, during this test, try out the concept of barbecue when it's something that was called barbecue. It consisted of slowly rolling the spacecraft on the way to the moon for the lunar mission, and so that the sun wouldn't just be on one part of the spacecraft for a long time. And they were a little bit afraid of what might happen if you didn't roll the spacecraft slowly, structurally. And so we got into this test, and unlike flying in space, of course, we were in 1G in a chamber at JSC in Houston, and so we had to have accommodations like a toilet in there that would work in 1G like most toilets were aware of, and it was a pretty interesting test. After it was all over, we briefed the Apollo 7 crew, Walt and Wally and Don Isley, and so that's kind of what that was about. I will say that there was one mishap. The 1G toilet failed in the middle of the test, and so we had all this bad stuff on the floor and all that, and it was terrible at first, but actually you could get used to the smell.
You should have tried it in 0G.
You know, this is funny because my notes specifically say, do not ask the astronauts, how do you go to the bathroom in space? But all of the stories involve either we had toilets today, we got skivvy recycling yesterday, the skivvy extension program was on Friday. Are there any other undergarment related stories that we need to hear while we're here?
I have to tell you that nothing in those days, we didn't have to worry about any of those pieces of equipment. We didn't have any of that.
But
And I remember also that we held off until at least 2 days, and it was a very important exercise, incidentally. And after Apollo, boy, I'm not sure I should be talking about this. after Apollo 1, for a different reason, I think, but they ended up with oxygen masks in the cockpit. And I'll never forget this, is Wally was the first one to pull that oxygen mask. They started wearing oxygen masks whenever anybody had to go to the bathroom. Also, I can't remember if I was the first one or not, but I wrote a one-page memo in my record there on board that we could use on how to go about doing this and the problems and how to take care of them. So my book, The All-American Boys, I put that full memo in that in case anybody's curious. I'll say this. You had to be careful, and it took a long time, 50 minutes, maybe an hour, something like that. But we got along okay.
Just for the record, I had to say that. It just says, do not ever ask them that here in the notes. But this is the stuff that's not on Wikipedia, guys. All right, Wally, another question for you here. Apollo 7 was your first flight, but also it was the first flight of the command module. Did you and Wally and Don encounter any surprises with the vehicle during the mission?
Actually, after Apollo 1, we eventually got some simulators put together, and I think, in spite of what some of the people do today on preparation, I think we had about 75 or 80 hours in the simulator before we flew. Wow. And at the time, we felt pretty good, but I remember we felt quite comfortable in it. We were not stupidly ignorant about what the risks were, but I don't remember us being I don't remember any word about being frightened about what it was, and I'll tell you why. There's a big difference between what the culture is today and what it was then. We were all military fighter pilots. Most of them were test pilots. And rightly or wrongly, we wouldn't do something like that without the kind of confidence it took to do it. I don't remember ever in my entire life ever launching or doing anything else that I didn't think I could handle whatever might happen. Does that mean that was accurate? I can't tell you that, but you've got to have that kind of confidence to be able to do it. So we weren't frightened, although we were aware of where there might be things that you ought to be concerned about. And was Fred here, he handled a lot tougher problems than we had.
The next question, I'd like to go to Gerry. So Gerry, you're an aerospace engineer that operated as a flight controller and a flight director during Gemini and the early Apollo program. How did the preparation for Apollo differ from the earlier Gemini flights? And how did the complexity of the operations of multiple rendezvous, multiple spacecraft, new systems, how did that change the way mission control worked and the ways that you made decisions?
To answer the last part of that question first, it didn't change much. And unlike what Walt was talking about, we actually ended up eventually not only in Gemini, but in Apollo. We had some, I think, very high fidelity sims that the guys spent a lot more time than you got to get because they were just coming online. We had superb training for the later dynamic phases. One thing about Apollo that I think is different than what we're seeing today, I talked about this the other day with some of the guys and gals at JSC, is that Apollo was always active. We even when we were coasting to the moon or coming back from it, we were doing mid-course corrections and water dumps and barbecuing somebody you were talking about. And then we would do maneuvers of one kind or another. So it felt active all the time. Then you had the really dynamic stuff at the moon that with going into lunar orbit and then PDI and going down to land and so forth. So we were well prepared, probably better prepared in later Apollo than we were maybe in Gemini, but even there we had some pretty good simulation capability. We did it at the Cape early on, then we moved it to Houston. And in the control center, this is a funny thing about the Apollo training. I can remember, and I see Gerry Bostic sitting up here, I bet we some days did 10 launch sims, 8 or 10 launch from Earth sims, and every one of them with major problems and aborts and all kinds of things. Is exhausting. But boy, I really think the missions in Apollo were easier than the simulations, for the most part, except for 13. I'll give you that. But it was. We didn't change much. The philosophy that started in mission control pretty well is where we ended up.
Okay. Now, to carry on a little bit about these mission control procedures, there's a story, and maybe it's an urban legend, and maybe it's a misconception, but there's a story that there was disagreement between the Apollo 7 crew that was in space and the support staff on the ground operating mission control. Now, in our modern time, we forget these are the days where we didn't have relay satellites and constant comms. And, Walt, you guys are going constantly over a ground station for a small amount of time, and you have limited comms. Can you talk a little bit about, hey, this was the first time we did this, and what was the relationship between the space test plan and the interaction with mission control during Apollo 7? And this is really a question for
Okay, well, if you want me to talk
you.
about the interaction, do you want me to speak up for Wally?
It's your night. You can say whatever you like.
Well, we had to get used to it too on board, but it was kind of like a different in philosophy, and unfortunately, Wally got a cold. Today, if you read about it, they like to say that everybody had a cold. Not the case. Those of you who have not heard it before, I will stick to whatever it is. Wally had a cold. Don may have coughed a couple times first day, but he never had a cold, and I never had a cold either. But Wally, who was our commander, and also was damn good at what he was responsible for, believe me. But when Wally had a cold, the first couple of days, he spent quite a bit of time underneath his couch and trying to sleep and taking pills. And when Wally took a pill, he had to make sure we took a pill too. So it was kind of interesting experience. It was not so interesting. It was pretty awkward for the ground and air to ground with some of these things. On board, we rolled along with it. And I don't think it was a terrible case, but it created a lot of problems for flight control, I guess, on that. Other than that, I don't remember anything being very bad about it. But there were several, incidentally, differences between what the crew wanted to do and what the ground wanted to do. And for example, on re-entry, not wearing the helmets because Wally wanted to make sure he could clear his nose on it. And I don't remember on the flights after that, didn't a lot of people come in without their helmets on? We didn't wear our helmets.
Remember. I think so, but you know, I don't think we did in the later flights. I think we did have the helmets off, but it was 50 years ago. So why are you asking? I don't. I will say that, Apollo 7 was my first mission as a flight director, and the agitation that went on was a shock to us on the ground. It was kind of out of left field, and it hadn't happened before, and it didn't happen after. We had always been kind of in sync with each other, and so it was. I think most of us were shocked. Glenn Lunny, who was the lead flight director on that flight, was beside himself, and but as you say, we got past it. We were all grown up, and it wasn't. At the end of the day, I can remember telling a reporter. In fact, his name was Bill Hines from the Chicago Sun-Times. In a post-shift briefing, he was trying to get me to lay the bad mouth on the crew. And I finally told him, I said, Bill, we're like a football team. Everybody has their own blocking assignments. We carry ours out, and I can't worry about what the left tackle's doing when I'm a wide receiver. So I said, it's not that big a deal. And that kind of shut him up, and we went on.
Well, I can tell you this, that probably people down here don't know much about. We had our concern on board, too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was less than it could be. But I also tell you this. That flight was going so well, and the equipment and the fixes that they'd done, 1,040 changes, I think, have been made since the Apollo 1 fire. We lived with it. A lot of those were almost just operational changes, or very minor changes, and some of them were very important. And we were running so smoothly on that mission, 11 days, that they added 4 mission objectives to that flight after we had lifted off. And in the end, when we came back, they declared it 101% successful. And I agree with that, incidentally, because we were working all the time, even with whatever irritation might have gone on from the air to ground.
One final point. I really think Apollo 7 was perhaps the most critical mission in the sequence. Had 7 not worked, and even if it had been something like an abort with the crewmen surviving fine, I think it would have probably stopped the space program, dead in its track, and we may have never gotten to the moon. It was that critical that it worked. 7 then enabled 8. Had not 7 worked, we would have never attempted 8. And so, hats off. A very, very critical step in the space program, and it worked. Thank goodness.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, gentlemen, there's an open question. I want to kind of continue that thought. Looking back 50 years ago, it was such an aggressive program, and it was a return to flight. So when it was so successful, you guys were flying the mission, you guys were working, getting ready for 8, it was coming up next. What was the feeling? What was it like where you just go like, I can't believe we did all that? I mean, how did you feel when it was successful?
This is probably something that a lot of people don't know. I can see one person in here tonight, his name is Gerry Bostic again, that knew anything about 8 going to the moon early. Glenn Lunny and I were talking just yesterday that it was after 7 landed that we found out that 8 was going to go to the moon. And so I guess NASA could keep some secrets. But there was a small group put together, and Gerry was a part of it, and they looked at the feasibility. In fact, if I know from the Mission Control movie, Gerry said, that's the craziest damn thing I've ever heard of, trying to go to the moon on Apollo 8. But they had figured it out and pretty well had it, hadn't pulled the trigger, but were ready to pull it if 7 worked, and 7 did. But a lot of us didn't tie 8 to 7 until after 7 landed.
It was kind of,
Yeah,
it's kind of, excuse me, go ahead.
I was going to say, I joined, it was my first career assignment. I joined 8 as Bill Anders' backup. And during that time before that decision was made, we were training for about 2 months for the wrong mission. We were training for a high apogee, I think 4,000-mile apogee, a rendezvous with the lunar module, which ultimately wasn't getting ready. And it turned out to be, for me at least, and for Bill to some degree, disappointing because we'd both spent a lot of time with the lunar module. And now we had a mission where there wasn't any lunar module. It just had a command module. It was the toughest training assignment I had. I backed up 11 and, as you know, flew 13 and backed up 16 because now we only had 4 months left to get ready for the real mission. And I also had to learn a lot I knew nothing about the command module. The only thing I'd had in my first year was a Vugarev show of what a command module is. So I knew more than I needed to know about the LEM, but didn't know anything about the command module. So that was tough for me and Bill to some degree, because he had concentrated on the LEM, getting up to speed during that 4 months.
As I remember at the time, you get so wrapped up in whichever mission you're training for, you almost aren't even aware of what's going on some of the other missions. And originally, Apollo 8 was supposed to be, they were going to fly a mission similar to ours, except they were going to be out, I think, 8,000 miles, wasn't it?
I thought it was 4,000, but it's a high apogee rendezvous mission.
Anyhow, it's a similar kind of mission because they didn't expect Apollo 7 to be as successful as it is. And as a matter of fact, that was a little bit of a surprise to us. We knew what the mission was supposed to do. We were going to do the best we could. But it was kind of a surprise to go the whole way. I think everybody was kind of surprised. So then you end up with Apollo 8 got changed, and they've trained for that for a number of weeks, but it was not approved to do it. And only afterwards did I understand that they didn't make the final decision until, 2 weeks after we got back. And they had a wonderful mission. Everybody today, if you ask the public at large today about the space program back then, they will all remember Apollo 11 for obvious reasons. And some will remember Apollo 8 because it went out around the moon. And Apollo 13 they'll remember because they had a movie about it. But the internal aspects that went on and those kind of changes, the public can't be aware of it. No.
Yeah, and Fred and Vance, do you guys want to add anything? Any other thoughts about, was it total pandemonium where it was we're changing the whole plan and we're moving everything around, we got new tests to run? And
Well, I think what happened, we started the training, I call it, in a more leisurely way, more like a 5-day week. We'd have meetings maybe on Saturday. And when it hit the fan that we're now changing things, Frank Borman immediately worked with training people. We went to 6 days a week. The last 2 months, we were literally at 7 days a week. Even when I got passed through on the weekend, we'd normally have meetings on Sunday, sometimes before we then headed back out to Kennedy. So it was, like I said, it was the toughest one to get, field you got ready for, and from standpoint of workload, it was the toughest of all the training assignments that I had.
You know, I don't know if you want to get into it, Pat, but
I want to get into everything. My flight doesn't leave until like 7 o'clock tomorrow, so we can go as long as you want.
there's no doubt that 8, I feel like we're kind of starting to transition to 8 here. 8 was the gutsiest call I think ever been made forever in spaceflight. Not only did we have to do what Fredo's talking about, the different training aspects and getting ready for this and ready for that, they launched on a Saturn V booster, first time to put humans on top of the Saturn V. And the flight before, which was called 502, was an unmanned Saturn that was an absolute mess, a disaster. Got pogo in the first stage, had two engines shut down in the second stage, and the third stage, the S4B, didn't reignite when it got into orbit. So we had 3 major functions in this Saturn V, the largest rocket ever built. And the guys at Marshall, you have to tip your hat to them. They ran a bunch of tests. They convinced everybody they knew what had caused each of those problems. One of them was busted fuel line. I know they put helium in to soften the blow of the pogo accumulators. And they convinced the leadership, primarily George Lowe, that they were ready to fly. And by golly, we put a command module on top of it and 3 guys and launched for the moon. So you think about the call was incredible. Now that was gutsy. I think it signaled the end of the space race. When we went to the moon on Apollo 8, the space race was over.
It was not only the space race being over, we thought that the Russians were headed for there too. We didn't know very much about the Russian program. Later, must have been 10 or 12 years later before we started getting some kind of real information on it. The Russians, the booster that they were developing to go to the moon, they'd had either 3 or 4, I've never been able to, which is exact, 3 or 4 attempted launches. And the farthest that any of those got was about one minute into the air. So basically I think we're overly concerned about the race for the Russians, if that was the motivation on it, because they never did get to the moon.
And you know, interestingly enough, we never did talked about, at least I didn't with you guys, we never talked about the Russians.
No.
Or the Soviets.
No.
Couldn't care less. We had our own thing to do. And we were a bunch of young people that thought we were bulletproof, and we weren't, but we thought we were. And but we never discussed the Soviet Union being ahead of us. But looking back is when historically you can kind of put a little perspective to it, and I do think I think it was over. I think the race was over at 8.
Well, what people today have a tough time realizing also, they were even younger than us. And at the time we had a total of 30 astronauts before we started killing them off in airplanes and spacecraft. And our average age at that time in the astronaut office was, I think it was 34 or 35. And in flight control, I think you were still in your 20s. 20, yes. And even at the time, we never even thought about that.
So you're saying there's value in believing that you're bulletproof?
It isn't so much believing you're bulletproof, it's being willing to stick your necks out and have confidence in dealing with it.
And you mentioned, was there pandemonium? Absolutely not. It was completely organized. Everybody had their head down and they were pushing. I remember thinking once, this seems like such a difficult task to even get Apollo 7 on up and going on time. I was amazed it was even possible. But when you got to Apollo 8, I was on the support crew down at the Cape, kind of watching over the, on the behalf of the crew, watching over the command module. And they were completely organized, as was Johnson Space Center, back then called the Manned Spacecraft Center. So I think it was just a thoroughly impressive act to pull all this off.
This 1968 place that you talk about sounds magical. If I ever get my time machine working, I'm definitely going back and working for you guys. So, Gerry, you had said in the tremendous oral history project that you contributed to for NASA, and by the way, if you haven't read it, Google Gerry Griffin oral history. You said that Apollo 8, the one that stands out in your mind is Apollo 8 was the best mission and the most significant and our biggest step forward for some of the reasons you mentioned. And you highlighted two events in the mission. First, the translunar injection burn, which you may have to explain for some of our audience members. And then when the crew first went behind the moon. That was, I think, the part where 3 humans disappeared behind another celestial body. Can you tell us a little bit about what was notable for those milestones, and then like how were you feeling when you realized I just sent 3 guys around the moon?
Yeah, in that oral history, I think the question I got was, what do you think was the most significant mission in Apollo? And most people would say, well, the landing. But I said, I don't feel that way. I feel it was 8. Because of some of the things I talked about earlier with the gutsy call and the booster and 7 working and 8 working just fine. But what I noted about something we never had done was TLI, the translunar injection, which was the burn that took you out of Earth orbit and headed you for the moon. We had never done that. And I can remember at ignition, I had a little feeling. I didn't tell anybody, I just had a little feeling. And I wasn't, Cliff Charlesworth was actually doing it, and I was sitting beside him. He was the flight director. And I thought, uh-oh, we've started this engine, and if we go too very long, we're headed for the moon. And at engine cutoff, and it was right on the money. I mean, it was right to the second and to the foot per second and everything else. I thought, holy, let me say mackerel. Holy mackerel, now we've done it. And we're going to have to do something big to get them back. And so it's just a realization, Pat, of kind of, we had taken a step that we had never done in space. And it struck me as a big one, that we better know what we're doing now. The other thing is when they went behind the moon on that first orbit, when they went out of sight, and we calculated the loss of signal, the LOS time, and it was right on the money. And then we had two clocks counting down to when if they didn't do a burn, they would come around a lot faster. They'd show up earlier, and if they did do the burn, that would knock them down into lunar orbit. It would be a little later. And but I noticed when they went behind the moon for an instant, you could not hear a pin drop in that control center. And I suspect you guys were in there because I think everybody in the program that had a badge was in the room. But it just brought home that we were there. After all these years, we were there, and damn close to being able to pull off a landing. And I remember how quiet the room got. And then there was a little rustling, and people got up to take a break. But most of us just sat there for the whole time they were behind the moon. And it was cool. It was really cool. And, the only other time that I've had one of these feelings, and it still gives me goosebumps when I think about it, is on 11 when Buzz said, we're picking up some dust. And it dawned on me we had an engine blowing on the surface and blowing up dust. And then I said, we're really there. And we're going to do it. And we did it.
Oh yeah, there's goosebumps in the room. So Fred and Vance, you guys were working the backup and support for 8. So while this is going on, like when they went behind the moon, where were you guys and what were you thinking and how were you feeling about like this is really happening?
Well, traditionally the backup crew would be in the control center because we were familiar with the flight plan and what the crew would be doing to maybe help or engage if something didn't go right. So really, we had a very relaxing time because things went pretty well per the flight plan on 8. I think one thing Bill Anders said the cycle, the water separator or something that overheated. That was about the only thing, was throw a switch and when they first went around the moon because of different, I guess, heat flux. So that's the only thing I remember at all that was, call it abnormal. So it was really, like I said, I was just another spectator in mission control watching things tick along.
Okay, and Vance, how about you?
Pretty much the same. I was Stoney for the launch. Stoney was a position at KSC, somebody that sat in the firing room at KSC and talked to the crew before launch. And I thought, this being the first manned launch of Saturn V, I thought it was pretty awesome and exciting. And I got to give the countdown, and after they were on their way, my job was pretty much over. Fred was, of course, in mission control at that point. I think, yeah, a lot of us were in mission control to observe, but I wasn't one of the actors.
Walt, how about you? What were you thinking as this was all going on?
Well, I don't remember being terribly worried about it at all. The burns, the critical thing, especially the burn behind the moon. But that's a case of being concerned about it happening when it has to. And I had great confidence in the people that were doing it. So we didn't have the same kind of uncertainty or concern about it that some of the others might. Today, if you talk to anybody, well, can I ask a question out here? Can I see the hands of those of you who had some personal involvement in the space program back in the 1960s? There's got to be some couple. Yeah, there's a few up there. Yeah. Those that matured, grew up, or what have you later, have a different kind of a feeling. Because if you ask anybody today about Apollo, other than Apollo 11, everybody's going to know. I personally believe that 500 years from now, that's the only thing they're going to remember about the 20th century. But the other things, they never, well, they will remember Apollo 8, of course, because it went out around the moon. And probably Apollo 13, because they made a movie about it. But
It was a really good movie.
But I have to tell you, But today, if you ask people, they never think of Apollo 7 or Apollo 9 because we were in Earth orbit. We never went out to the moon, and even when they study a little bit, they might find out about it. And that's because there was a lot of difference. Well, if you're interested later, you can ask me a question about it. There's a whole lot of differences in what the environment was like and what we had to put up with in Earth orbit as when we went out to the moon. And I'll be glad to say something about that sometime if you would like.
Okay. Well, before we go there, I wanted to, why don't we talk a little bit about that? Why don't you give us a little perspective on how that was different, and maybe, Fred, you can weigh in on your trip around the moon, as delightful as it sounded in the movie. And how were those environments really different, and how did you have to respond differently, or how did astronauts have to train or prepare differently for the differences in those environments?
Okay, well, first off, if you ask people today about Apollo, they all think that the budget for the Apollo was 5% of the national budget. It was one year, it was 5%. Other than that, it was a whole lot lower. So people have a hard time understanding what really went on and what the costs were then. We've changed the attitude a lot about it. They have no idea about the difference in the spacecraft and Earth orbital operations. For example, you can talk to the guys going to the moon and back, unless they're behind the moon, you always can do that. They have no idea that on Apollo 7 we had air-to-ground communications only by the basis of where we had a station on the ground and a couple of them in the ocean, not many. So we had air-to-ground communications about 4.5% of the time, which we thought was pretty good. We didn't have on our backs quite that often. The spacecraft is drifting. They think we should be taking a whole lot of pictures. Well, we had a real camera, nothing digital. And when you're drifting, because we didn't have enough fuel aboard to hold a particular attitude unless we needed it for like a bird or a re-entry, you're drifting. And when you're drifting, most of the time you're pointing out into the heavens, which every 45 minutes it changes from light to dark or dark to light. If you happen to be pointing at the ground and it happens to be daylight, 55% of the ground is covered by clouds. So there's just a whole lot of things that were different between the missions. At the time, it didn't bother us at all. I mean, we're glad to just be there doing it. But the public today, I don't think, is very well informed on what went on back in the 1960s. I really don't.
Well, I'd add that another thing that was different was we were in constant, if you want to call it, development to some degree. The limb, I know, did not stabilize the early limbs till about Apollo 13, till limb 7. Then we made the major mods to the longer duration missions on 15 through 17. So there's no more major mods. Software changed also in our little hand-wired computers to some degree through those missions. So it's got like a set of constant prototypes that we were building and flying through most of that program, which again changed things and what you had to have knowledge about, and so each time was a little bit of training to a new vehicle to some degree. So I don't know about the instrumentation side, they were always changing stuff. So what Mission Control even had to look at changed as we went through the program.
Another factor that I didn't mention when we were talking about getting pictures of the ground or what have you up there is I think this particular problem was fixed not on 8, but by 9 I think we finally got it. We had 5 windows. The biggest one was 10 inches across, and it was round, and it was in the hatch. But they were almost all in the same plane. They covered about 150 degrees. That's right, depending on where they happened to be pointing. And I told you how we were drifting around. Each of those windows was made up of 2 3/4-inch thick pieces of quartz. And there was a slight space in between. And that was so if you had one of them crack, you still had the good pressurization. Unfortunately, the glue or whatever it was that they put those windows in with started leaking. RTV? RTV. Well,
After you mentioned it the other day.
did you?
Yeah, it's RTP.
But what happened is the best window was there on the hatch. It's about 10 inches and it was a round window. And it was the first one that got this RTV starting leaking out. So it started getting drops in the middle. You couldn't really get any pictures out of that. And each of the windows got almost that point. I think the last one was the one on my side. I ended up getting to take more pictures because I was the last one that had a window that you could even look out. But you're facing all those limitations I told you before about drifting, not being able to port it, and what have it. But that was no big deal to us. I mean, it was just part of the flight, and as long as we had whatever was left that was necessary to make a reentry, that was it.
All right, well, for the last question of the night, I'd like to turn to Fred. And the question really, you know, there's a tiny number of humans that have flown to the moon. And, you know, on Apollo, you're going something like within 60 miles of the surface of the moon. What was it like, and can you describe to the audience what it was like to look down on the moon from that perspective, being that close to it?
Well, I think the moon was just another one of those things that was, to me, very unusual in flying in space compared to flying airplanes. Not just the moon, but even as we went into Earth orbit and we left, the scenes you see looking at space from the low altitudes, we were a little over 100 miles in Earth orbit, but then on the way back and forth from the moon, and at the moon themselves, my impression as I looked out at times, I'd say, am I really here looking at what I'm looking at? And there was more of that kind of feeling. Now the moon obviously, compared to Earth, is quite different. Doesn't look very friendly, unlike the Earth, which is very beautiful with the coloration of clouds and seas and continents you can even see from the moon. But the moon looks, and particularly the backside, appears to be much more cratered and rocky than we see from the front side, which has the big dark areas. There's only a few of those. We happened to shoot, because we were about 130-something miles as we went around the moon, and the angle at which we went around was about a half moon lit on the backside. We flew as about a half Earth and a half moon. And we shot some pictures of two features on the backside, which Farouk Al-Baz was one of our teachers. He was a scientist and teach people about people that had to shoot targeting on the moon, of a little bit of what it was about and why it was important. And he told us, because Jack Schweiger and I shot most of the pictures on the backside. I think Jim was still a little down that we had lost the landing. He'd been on the moon, this was the second time. He had been on 8 and back on 13, and we had lost the landing. So Jack and I had cameras out, and we did a lot of shooting pictures. And Farouk told us we got the best pictures ever taken of two features on the backside, unfortunately both named by the Russians. They got around first to shoot pictures. Tsiolkovsky, which is named after a Russian early rocket pioneer, much like Dr. Goddard in this country. And the other one was Sia Moscow. And so anyway, that was two features that we got credit for. From Farouk's view anyway, as some of the best pictures taken of those features.
Well, we still won. We still won. And we're still winning. So each of you has played an important part in the nation's effort to land humans on the moon. 1968, it sounds magical, but also it was a very difficult year for the country. We had political protests, we had the war in Vietnam and the Tet Offensive, We had anti-war demonstrations. We had the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, riots. And it's said that the Apollo 8 mission saved 1968. And you have all contributed to that and to winning the space race and meeting Kennedy's goal of putting a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. Can I get a round of applause? All right, well, we hope that you enjoyed this evening, and thanks to everyone that participated in this weekend's events. We had speakers on Thursday and Friday. We had this evening's discussions. It was truly amazing. And you've all supported the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation, which is looking forward to celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 voyage next year. We hope you can join us for the ridiculous flurry of activities you're going to see over the next 12 months. We're launching the commemorative coin, which is going to raise funds for the scholarships. We're launching our On the Shoulders of Giants campaigns, and we hope that you continue to be a part of supporting the next generation of scholars and their achievements in the STEM fields. The biggest news that we have is there's dessert in the other room, because we're still winning. So thank you for joining us. Enjoy your dessert, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.